June 19, 1944. 4 strikes go out that day. 373 machines claw into the Philippine sky, and by the time the last engine cuts over the task force, only 130 come back aboard. 243 aircraft lost in a single day. This is the force that stunned the world at Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. And those pilots, the ones who turned Battleship Row into an inferno, did not come from a sprawling mass production line. They came from a training system so selective, so slow, that it turned out aviators the way a machinist turns out a one-off engine. And that pre-war pilot factory was never retooled. It stayed small even as the war demanded numbers it could not produce. By the summer of 1944, the factory is spitting out replacement pilots with barely enough hours to keep a zero straight in a crosswind. The Philippine Sea is that factory running out of stock, all at once. So how does the force that carved up the US fleet in 1941 hollow out into a ghost by 1944? Not in the burning flight decks. The answer is in the classrooms and training fields of the 1930s. Before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy handpicks its carrier aircrew from a pool of recruits that has already survived years of basic training and rigorous screening. And what emerges from those specialized flight schools is a pilot of extraordinary quality, accurate and drilled to fly as one with his squadron. And yet the output is a trickle, a few dozen graduates a year, just enough to man a handful of fleet carriers in peacetime, and never to absorb the kind of losses that a real shooting war will generate. And the system is built to supply a peacetime fleet, not a war of attrition. The men are superb, but there are never enough of them, and their experience cannot be replaced. Consider what that system actually produces. The training turns out crews who can put a torpedo in the water at the right angle and fly out through anti-aircraft fire, who navigate by stars and long practice, drilled to feel an aircraft rather than simply operate it. A pilot like that is almost irreplaceable. The output over a decade is small, and deliberately so. A pilot factory built to prize quality over quantity. 5 men make up the entire first class of the Air Reserve student program, a tiny pipeline designed to draw university graduates into the Imperial Navy's flying ranks, even as the Navy has already built a fearsome carrier fleet. But the flight decks are far larger than the pool of men allowed to fill them. Not every graduate can apply. The screening strips away all but a handful, and by the time the 8th class assembles in 1941, the program has grown, but the 8th class numbers 48 men. That is it. On the eve of a Pacific War, the elite cadre of university-educated naval aviators numbers fewer than a single carrier's air group. And yet these men are being funneled into an arm that demands constant losses simply to stay sharp, where a single bad day over the ocean could erase a year's worth of graduates, and the math does not close. And when the first shot is fired, the system has no way to speed up. The question is how much punishment a force built on so few can absorb. The fist is devastating. Everyone agrees on that. A decade of sharpening has produced carrier air groups that can coordinate a massed strike over 300 miles out, flown by pilots whose skill no one questions. None of it stops anything coming the other way. Aboard the fleet carriers of the First Air Fleet, the ships have no radar, not a single set. The only way to spot an incoming raid is the oldest one in the book. A lookout on a platform straining his eyes against the glare, shouting a warning into a voice tube that the wind and the engine noise have already swallowed. By the time you hear him, the bombs are already falling. And that is the first crack in the design, and the second is what happens after the warning comes or doesn't. Since the combat air patrol the fighters kept back to protect the ships is never more than a handful of zeros. There are simply too few of them to cover a formation of carriers spread across miles of open ocean. The rest of the fighters are either escorting the strike or sitting on the deck waiting to be spotted, and a carrier under attack is, for terrifyingly long stretches, on its own. Yet the radios these few defenders carry are so poor that once a zero is airborne, coordinating it is a matter of guesswork, where a section leader might get a garbled vector or nothing at all. The only reliable formation is the one he can see with his own eyes, which leaves the escorts, the destroyers and cruisers, that should form a close anti-aircraft ring around the carriers, deployed instead miles ahead, strung out as a scouting line, visual sentries in an age that is already tilting toward the radar-directed fighter direction center. The Americans are building as fast as they can bolt antennas to their own carriers. The Japanese fleet can throw a punch that will black out an anchorage. But if that punch does not end the fight in one blow, what remains is a force whose warships are positioned to watch the horizon, not to protect the flight decks. A historian, Mark Peaty, later names this a glass jaw, a weapon that can deliver a shattering first strike but cannot absorb one in return. The carriers have the striking power but lack the layered defense that lets a fleet take a hit and keep fighting. Early warning, fighter direction, close-in anti-aircraft coordination. The first place that jaw gets tested is a mid-ocean atoll called Midway. The battle that unfolds over 4 days in June of 1942 does exactly what the first air fleet was built to do, and exactly what it could not survive. 4 Japanese fleet carriers go to the bottom, and a heavy cruiser joins them. The Imperial Navy loses the strategic initiative in the Pacific, and the assumption that follows is that Japan's elite carrier air crews died with their ships. They didn't. But the casualty records tell a different story. The count of Japanese aircrew killed at Midway is about 110 men, most of them going down with Hiryu, the last carrier to burn. It is a grievous loss. Squadron leaders, veteran section heads, men who had been flying combat since China. But the other 3 carriers lose their flight decks, their hangars, and their engineering spaces without losing all their pilots, because many aircrew are airborne when their ships are hit. Others are plucked from the water by escorting destroyers, and they survive. They return to Japan. They will fly again. So why does the myth persist? Because losing 4 carriers looks like losing everything, and the arithmetic is easy to assume. 4 carriers gone, therefore all their aircrew gone. But that is not what the muster rolls show, as American aircrew losses at Midway are actually heavier. More U.S. torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter pilots are shot down or ditch at sea than the Japanese lose, and the butcher's bill does not line up with the legend. What Midway really is, stripped of the myth, is the moment the machinery breaks while the men inside it survive. The glass jaw shatters. The offensive weapon, the coordinated carrier strike, is torn away, but the pilots, the irreplaceable product of that tiny pre-war pipeline, mostly live, which means the true reckoning is still ahead. They are about to be fed into a grinding campaign. In the late summer of 1942, they push east, into the Solomon Islands. The Japanese call it the southeastern area. For the air groups, it becomes a place where experience, not machines, gets consumed. The first test comes in August in the Eastern Solomons. A carrier clash fought through squalls and search planes. A blind groping action where neither fleet ever sees the other, but the flyers find each other. And when the strikes cross in the air, the margin between survival and the sea is measured in combat hours. The instinct that tells a pilot when to brake and when to let the Zero's climb rate carry him clear of a Wildcat's guns. That instinct is not doctrine. It cannot be taught from a manual. It accumulates mission by mission under fire. And now it is draining away as every carrier engagement in the Solomons takes men who own that instinct. Not staggering numbers. Not yet. But these are not recruits. They are section leaders. Flight petty officers are the handful of men who can read a fight in 3 dimensions and know where they are needed. Lose one of them and you lose the man who would have trained his replacements. By October, at Santa Cruz, the erosion becomes visible. The strikes still get through. The dive bombers still press home, but the formations are looser, the timing is off, and the escorting Zeros arrive with less cohesion and fewer familiar voices on the radio, while the Japanese carriers pull back with a tactical win on the scorecard. But the air groups are shadows, and the names on the briefing rosters are changing. The new ones fly the aircraft competently, but what they do not have is the thing that keeps a man alive when the sky fills with tracers. The accumulated feel for the battle stored in the body after hundreds of hours above the water. No training command can replicate it, and no accelerated course can condense it, because battle experience is a resource as finite as fuel, and Japan is burning through its reserves faster than any replacement system could ever rebuild them. The Solomons are not destroying the carrier force in a single blow. They are bleeding it of the men who knew how to fight. The campaign fixes on an airstrip. Henderson Field is a strip of crushed coral and dirt that the Japanese command decides it must retake. And that decision turns the lower Solomons into a furnace. The fuel is the same naval air arm that struck Pearl Harbor. By the time the last Japanese troops evacuate Guadalcanal in February 1943, the loss figures for the campaign list 800 aircraft gone, and with them, 2,362 pilots and crew. Set that against the force that started the war, a pilot corps built in small hand-finished classes. The loss came in daily increments over 6 months rather than in one battle. Many of these crews never engage an enemy carrier. They are lost on reinforcement runs between Rabaul and the airstrip, a long round trip over open ocean with no land to ditch on if the engine fails. And that is what hollows out the force. They die in daily scrambles over Henderson Field, where American pilots can land, refuel, and climb again while the Japanese formations exhaust their fuel just getting there. They die in the brutal arithmetic of a battle, where one side can absorb attrition and the other is burning through a stockpile it never had. And this is where the system fails. The campaign kills the veterans of the Kido Butai and their replacements alike. The half-trained men pushed forward to fill the gaps left by Midway and Santa Cruz. Each one lost before he could learn the trade well enough to teach it to someone else. The accumulation of experience runs in reverse. As the force gets weaker the longer it fights, what the High Command does about it in February 1943 is almost nothing. That nothing is an institutional decision to keep the training program as it was in 1941. Same tests, same flight hour requirement, same intake criteria. While American flight schools expand their output and shorten the path from classroom to cockpit, Japan's Naval Air Training Program does not add an extra week of flight instruction. It does not lower the entry bar to draw from a larger pool, nor does it switch from university graduates to mass intake. The result is replacement pilots with a fraction of the hours their American rivals have. Men who can fly the aircraft, but not fight it. Losses mount without a surge of new aviators to fill the gaps. The few that survive the first sortie become veterans overnight. But they are too few and too tired, and there is no one to relieve them because the schools are still turning out pilots at a peacetime pace. Operational pilot numbers fall, the quality of new arrivals decays, and still the command refuses to trade perfection for volume. The system stays frozen while the war accelerates, so the Navy looks elsewhere for strength, to the islands, to the concrete runways that need no flight decks. The pilots who will wait there are the same half-trained men the carriers can no longer use. On 1 July 1943, the Imperial Navy creates a new fleet without launching a single hull, as the first air fleet is reborn on paper as a land-based force anchored to a chain of island airfields from the home islands to the Central Pacific, with tables of organization calling for nearly 1,600 aircraft. The logic is as hard as the coral they intend to pave. Reefs do not sink, and an airfield cannot be ambushed at 20 knots the way a carrier task force can. So the Navy scatters its strength across a string of island airfields, every runway a flight deck bolted to the earth, immune to torpedoes. But the war has run the air groups ragged, and the replacement stream from the home islands is a trickle that cannot fill the gaps. So when the order takes effect, the first air fleet's combat strength is not 1,600 machines. It is 2 air groups. 1,600 aircraft remain a planning figure, a number no one can climb into and no one can launch. The plan is an elegant answer to a question that has already changed. It banks on geography when it cannot bank on men, planting squadrons on islands that the enemy must attack head-on, buying time for the carrier force to rebuild. But a stationary air force cannot mass, cannot shift, cannot pursue, and a pilot forced to spend the battle circling over his own runway is a pilot fighting on the enemy's terms. That lesson will be taught in a single afternoon next June. For now, the 2 air groups on the roster carry their own hollow numbers. The real inventory inside those units, counted plane by plane, is smaller still. By the spring of 1944, the numbers are no longer ambiguous, and the strength return for Air Group 652 lists what the unit actually possesses. Against an authorized strength of 81 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 27 torpedo bombers, the page gives you a handful of airframes, 30 Model 21 Zeros, and 13 Model 52 Zeros. 4 D-3A dive bombers, that is the entire combat strength of a carrier air group. No torpedo bombers at all. Now, the Model 52 is the latest Zero variant, faster and better armed, but it is still a design that trades armor and self-sealing tanks for range and agility. The Model 21 is the older variant, the type the Americans first met in 1941. The D-3A, for all its early war lethality, is a fixed-gear dive bomber that cannot survive against modern fighters without escort. 4 of them do not make a strike force. With 4 dive bombers, a thin screen of fighters, and no torpedo aircraft, the answer is plain. It cannot conduct a coordinated deck strike, it cannot launch the bomb and torpedo combination that carrier doctrine demands. And the air group exists on paper, but as a combat instrument, it is already collapsed. And the carriers waiting for these machines are real steel at anchor, their flight decks empty and their elevators idle. The numbers on this sheet tell you how many of those decks will stay that way. What do you put on those carriers when the page says you have almost nothing left? On the 1st of March 1944, the order takes effect, assigning Air Group 652 to the 2nd Carrier Division, which has 3 ships, Hio, Junyo, and Ryoho, 3 flight decks, 3 sets of elevators, hangar space designed to swallow squadrons whole, nothing ranged on deck, nothing warming up below. A single air group split across 3 carriers leaves each ship with a fraction of a fraction, and much of that hangar space stays empty. What a carrier air group is supposed to look like, the deck packed from island to bow, is something these crews have not seen in months. In the spring of 1944, what Air Group 652 brings to the division does not fill 1 carrier, let alone 3. And you cannot train pilots without flying. The anchorage they are about to steam toward, ringed by American submarines, is a place where the order of the day will be to stay put and wait. It has a name, Tawi-Tawi. Tawi-Tawi sits close to Borneo, a scatter of islands in the southern Philippines, and the anchorage itself is sheltered water, exactly the kind of place a fleet can hide. For the men of the 2nd Carrier Division, it is the wrong place to be. The green pilots aboard Hio, Junyo, and Ryuho need airtime to take off, form up, navigate, and land, the muscle memory work that keeps a carrier strike group from killing itself before it ever sees the enemy. But Tawi-Tawi has no airfield, no strip, and no place to put a training aircraft down on solid ground. Every single takeoff has to happen from a pitching deck, and every recovery has to find that deck again. So they wait, sweating through the days in the hangar bays, because the anchorage is a trap with only one way out, and that exit is watched. American submarines are working the waters around Tawi-Tawi, sitting on the sea lanes and waiting for anything worth a torpedo. Every route out of the anchorage crosses a submarine patrol line. By the end of May, he makes the call that there are no more open ocean sorties, the carriers stay inside the lagoon, the pilots stay on deck, and training stops. The men who will fly against Task Force 58 in 3 weeks run through the motions on the ground. The flying that builds muscle memory, the formation work, the dive drills, the feel for how an aircraft behaves loaded with fuel and a torpedo, none of it happens. A carrier anchored in a lagoon is a warehouse. The pilots aboard are not training, they are waiting. And every day without a sortie widens the gap between what these men can do and what the mission demands. You can measure it. The American pilots steaming towards Saipan have been flying for months, with hundreds of hours in the cockpit, gunnery runs, tactical problems, and night landings, while the Japanese pilots at Tawi-Tawi have only the hours they brought with them, and nothing more. When the order comes to sortie, his air groups will launch from a standing start, undertrained, underflown, and pinned inside a lagoon until the last possible moment. That is the arithmetic Ozawa cannot escape. These men have about 50 hours of flight time in total, and little combat training with it. No gunnery against a moving target, no dives on a ship, no anti-aircraft fire from an American task force. So what kind of aviator does that produce? One who has never hit a moving target in the air and never pulled out of a dive with a ship under the nose. But the American pilot who meets them above the Philippine Sea has 600 hours, has trained for over a year, and has run these sequences 1,000 times. Mock dogfights, live drops, formation flying in weather that eats the horizon. That is a manufacturing process, precise and repeatable, and unlike the Japanese system, which still treats every aviator as a one-off. So when the two forces meet in June, one side knows the air and the other is still learning it. And the question that hangs over the anchorage is not whether the Japanese pilots will fight, they will, but what 50 hours of flight time costs a man in a cockpit when the sky fills with Hellcats. The Imperial Navy's own aviation casualty tally opens on 16 December 1941. From that date, as crews are lost across the Pacific, at Midway, in the Solomons, over New Guinea, the count keeps rising. So by the time the 50-hour rookies are ordered into their cockpits above the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Navy's own internal record already runs to thousands. The final figure, tallied through 20th March 1945, stops at 14,242 aircrew and 1,579 officers killed in action. That is not the total cost of a single battle, but the cumulative weight of a pipeline that never learned to stop breaking. What stands out is how little changed to slow it. The training pipeline stayed frozen, and the pilot factory kept turning out men with barely enough time in type. And the ledger kept making entries. June 1944 and the losses at the Philippine Sea were no anomaly, but they were the point where the curve steepened past any hope of recovery. For the better part of a year after Santa Cruz, the Imperial Navy pours its remaining industrial strength into reconstituting the carrier air groups that 1942 had gutted, pulling new airframes from assembly lines and cycling replacement pilots through the training commands. The work consumes men and machines at a rate that makes peacetime logic irrelevant. Build, train, ship, repeat, while the front line keeps collapsing westward. That machinery grinds forward, filling out squadron rosters and signing off on pilots who can barely hold a formation, let alone fight one. On paper, it restores the carrier wings to something that looks, on a briefing chart, like a fighting force. But the men inside those cockpits carry a fraction of the hours their predecessors brought into the Coral Sea. And the machines are stopgaps, older models, hurried repairs, airframes that should have been scrapped. By June of 1944, Japan has cobbled together a carrier air arm that exists on paper, and little more. And then the Americans arrive. On the morning of June 19th, the first strike goes out. And by nightfall of June 20th, after 2 days of combat, the rebuilt air groups are destroyed. The record puts the loss at roughly 90% of that rebuilt force. What Japanese industry assembled in 12 months, American naval aviation destroyed in 48 hours. And that gap is the real story. The command keeps feeding the machine because the alternative is to stop fighting. The planes keep rolling off the lines, the recruits keep reporting for flight training, and the staff officers keep moving pins across a shrinking map. The 2-day loss exposes the distance between what Japan intended and what its industry and its training system could actually deliver. And now, with its carrier wings reduced to slicks and scattered wreckage, the Imperial Navy reaches for the only option left. By June 1944, the Americans have troops ashore on Saipan, and the war's geography snaps into brutal clarity as that island sits deep inside Japan's inner defensive line. So deep that from its airfields, the new B-29 will be able to reach Tokyo. The combined fleet cannot let that happen, so it activates Operation A-Go and commits everything that can still float and fly. And the scheme is a carrier ambush designed to pounce on the U.S. fleet while it is pinned to the beachhead, supporting the landing, unable to maneuver freely. But it counts on land-based aircraft to even the odds, and it counts on a level of aircrew proficiency that the fleet has not possessed since 1942. The plan hangs on that assumption. A single decisive battle, fought and won in one blow. The carriers are under strength, and their replacement pilots can barely find the fleet. The order still goes out, and Admiral Toyota stamps it with a phrase that leaves no room for retreat. The fate of the Empire rests on this one battle. And at 9 o'clock, the flagship Taiho heels into the wind. The signal rises, launch. Across 3 flight decks, Taiho, Shikaku, and Zuikaku, engines open to full throttle, and the first Zeke lifts off, dips, then claws upward. Every pilot who climbs out this morning is the product of a system that refused to scale, and the bill is now coming due in airframes. 128 of them, a maximum effort built on 50-hour pilots who have barely drilled formation flying since Tawi-Tawi. That is the force that now banks east. 53 Judys, the Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber, fast but unarmored. 27 Jills, the Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber, flown by crews with almost no live torpedo work behind them. 48 Zekis, the Zero that stunned the world in 1941. Still deadly in the hands of a veteran, though most of the men at those control columns are replacements. And 1 Judy, stripped of its bomb load and carrying chaff. The chaff aircraft is a small detail, but it says something about the expectation on the flag bridge. Not surprised, but a few minutes of confusion on American radar screens. Long enough to get the strike through. The formation climbs through scattered cloud, the pilots scanning an empty horizon, while to the east, somewhere beyond the curve of the sea, Task Force 58 is waiting, and American radar picks up the formation long before it arrives. But the Japanese pilots do not know that. They know the mission, find the carriers, punch through the fighter screen, and put bombs on flight decks. And they know, with a clarity that sits cold in the stomach, that most of them have never done this before. Not against a defended fleet. Not against the fighter direction system the US Navy has spent 2 years refining into a killing machine. The strike force drones east in loose sections, the morning sun climbing behind it. Some of these men flew at Pearl Harbor. Most did not, and have only ever practiced against towed targets. They are crossing the point of no return, and behind them the carriers are already turning away, clearing their decks for the second wave. Ahead, the American radar operators are watching the blips multiply on their scopes, and the Hellcats are already climbing to meet them. The Hellcats intercept well short of the American carriers, hitting the Japanese strike before the escorting Zekis can react. And the green pilots try to hold formation, but within minutes the wave breaks apart. Across the 4 raids, American pilots claim 299 kills. The actual Japanese air-to-air losses, pieced together from fragmentary records, land somewhere between 220 and 224 aircraft. But the equipment count is not the whole of it, because among those losses are 22 of the 35 squadron commanders who led the strikes. And alongside them, many of Japan's most senior surviving fighter pilots, men who flew from the opening hours of the war. These are the officers who survived Midway, the Solomons, Santa Cruz. The handful of veterans who were supposed to teach the replacements how to fight and how to stay alive. And now, they are gone. The institutional memory of the carrier air arm collapses in a single day, leaving carriers full of green pilots and no one to lead them. The later waves meet the same Hellcat wall, already vectored by radar, and the pattern repeats. Commanders go first, formations dissolve, survivors scatter. What comes back to the carriers is a scattering of survivors. Aboard the flagship, the tallies come in piecemeal. A report from a returning fighter squadron, a signal from a carrier that has lost its air group, and the count reaches the flag bridge in pieces. By nightfall, the number settles. Vice Admiral Ozawa's flag log closes the day's fighting with a line that requires no commentary. Surviving carrier air power, 35 operational aircraft out of the 430 that filled the hangar decks at dawn. The rest were shot down, went down with the carriers Taiho and Shokaku, or ran out of fuel short of the decks. The math is not metaphorical. It is a physical fact. The Japanese carrier striking force has ceased to exist as a weapon. The 35 are whatever came back flyable, or never found the enemy at all, and they now sit in hangar bays surrounded by vacant tie-down points. A fleet with 35 operational planes cannot strike and cannot defend itself against a concerted air attack. It can only withdraw. And American search planes have been tracking the Japanese force all afternoon, and somewhere to the east, Task Force 58 is already preparing the next blow. In the long afternoon light, the strike groups launch from the carriers of Task Force 58. Hio, a converted passenger liner turned light carrier, is steaming with the rest of the mobile fleet, carrying what remains of Air Group 652. She survived the previous day. She will not survive this one. The bombs catch her first, punching through the flight deck and exploding below. Then the torpedo into the hull at the waterline, flooding compartments and killing her speed. The deck begins to tilt. Inside the hangar, gasoline vapor from ruptured fuel lines collects in the enclosed space. The damage reports record what follows: a gasoline vapor explosion that lifts the flight deck and sends fire through the ship. Hio heels over and sinks, but Air Group 652 is not entirely gone. In the final chaotic minutes, its pilots, flying from Hio and her sisters, claim 2 Hellcats and 9 Avengers shot down. Yet the loss is severe. 11 aircraft never return, and 3 more ditch. The air group that never had enough planes to fill a single carrier is finished as a fighting unit. What is left is a handful of carriers. Zukaku survives the battle. Now it is late October 1944. The Philippine Sea has swallowed 3 carriers and most of their air groups. Zukaku, the last of the 6 flat tops that launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, steams north of Luzon as Ozawa's flagship. And then the American strike finds her, pushing over through a sky already dirty with flak. So the bombs bracket the hull, heaving columns of white water against the gray flank, while the ship heels into a hard turn. The flight deck canting like a table in an earthquake. There is almost nothing left to launch. The hangar below is quiet, the elevators still, the arrestor wires slack. The ship can only twist and take the hits. And so the ship twists as the gunners pour fire into the sky. The hits come anyway, bombs through the flight deck and into the hangar, torpedoes into the hull. Zukaku lists hard to port, smoke pouring from her, and early in the afternoon she goes down stern first. The last of the Pearl Harbor carriers is gone. The men who once flew from this deck came from a system of exacting precision, one that could turn out unmatched pilots but never learned to mass produce them. The carrier outlived its pilots,